My first step is going to be to mark the center of my fabric. Now, the centering arrows are on here, and you'll see that they're just one space over, or actually just a half of a space over from one of the dark grid lines. So for our purposes, let's consider this grid line as being the center of the chart. I don't have to baste very much because what I'm actually going to be looking for is this point right here. So once I find my center, I only need to come down 10, or not even 10, 8, I'll be coming down 8 squares and over 12 squares to find this point. Now my fabric is square, but I'm going to consider the part with the selvage as being on the left. And I'm going to fold my fabric in half once. Just put a little bit of a crease there, and then fold it in half again. So basically I folded it into quarters, and this is my center. And somewhere I have a needle. Let me get my needle. And I'm just going to put my needle there for just a moment. And fold the fabric again. You really don't have to baste very much. And notice that since I'm working on linen and I'm going to be stitching over 2, I have basted over 2, under 2, over 2, under 2. Where these two lines are intersecting, that is the center of my chart. And I only came down, I don't know, 10 or 12 stitches coming down in this direction. Because once I get started, I'm going to get rid of these basting lines because I won't need them anymore. So again, these two lines are the same as this point right here, from about here and on down and crossing right here. Now we're going to start right here with the chimney. So that's the heart symbol. So we look on our color code and we see that the heart is dark hunter. So whether you're working with DMC or Cosmo, you want your dark hunter. I store my floss on thread drops, and I pencil in the symbol for that color that goes with this chart. Now the next time I use 637, it may or may not be a heart symbol. And I can take my needle and pick up a single strand and just pull it straight out. And although this looks like a rat's nest right now, it just very, very easily straightens out. I'm going to set this aside. And now my single strand here, I take my dampened sponge, and I'm going to dampen this to straighten it out. I always, always, always do this. And it isn't important to stitch with it while it's wet. That doesn't matter. If you dampened it and then got called away or whatever, and you came back and it was dry, that's okay. But you can see how straight the floss is. And that's the objective here, is to get your floss straight, and then that's going to make it much, much less likely to knot. I'm going to use the loop method for stitching. So into the eye of my needle, I'm going to place the 2 cut ends of my long length. Now this piece of floss is about 30 inches long, but once I start stitching, it's only going to be 15 inches. 15 to 16 inches is what I recommend. So at one end I've got my loop, and at the other end I've got the 2 cut ends threaded into the eye of my needle. So my next thing that I need to do here is to figure out exactly where to place that first stitch. So from this intersection, I'm going to come down 9 stitches and over 10, 11, 12 stitches to get to this point right here, so I can start my first stitch. So down 9 and over 12. Now I'm stitching in hand, but you can certainly stitch this in a hoop or scroll bars or Q-snap or whatever. So I'm coming down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 is right there. And then over, I'm going to come over 12. So I'm going to count by 2. So that's 1 stitch. That's 1, 2, 3, so that's 12. Now my first half cross, I'm going to go over 2 and up 2. And then I'm going to turn this over. And pull it almost all the way through, and then slip my needle into the loop. Now, an important step here, this is a small thing, but it's kind of important. I'm going to turn this around so it's a little easier to handle. You want to make sure that that loop is down tight against your fabric. So I'm going to pull here and then pull here. You don't want, this loop should not be left loose. So I've made my first half cross. Now we're using the Danish method right now, which is to say that we're stitching a half cross over and a half cross back. So the chimney is 2 stitches wide. So I'm just going to make 2 half crosses here. And then cross back over them. If you prefer to do whole stitches, that's okay. But I'm going to be using a variety of methods. Some English, some Danish, some Victorian. Some I don't even have a name for, I guess. Just whatever works for that spot. I will also, you'll see from time to time, we'll be using a sewing method, like right now. I'm going to finish that stitch and start the next stitch, which is basically what you're doing when you're sewing. Also notice that I am keeping my 2 threads parallel here. I don't use the railroad method, but I do keep my 2 threads parallel. I make sure they're not overlapping each other. Now make sure that you're staying underneath your working thread. Needle pointers call this laying the threads. When you make sure that they're just parallel to each other. I'm not really sure why, but I tend to sew, when I'm using the Danish method, I tend to sew the first half cross, but then poke and pull going the other way. Now the chimney is 3 rows high, so another pair of stitches and I'll be done with the chimney. I'm going to set my needle right here for a second. That would be finishing that stitch and starting the next stitch. But I want to make sure, now I'm pretty sure my next stitch is going to be one stitch out to the left from the chimney. So let's take a look at the chart. So yes, the chimney, I'm now done with the 3 rows of 2 at the chimney. So now I'm going to pop out one here to the left and start stitching across. Now the question is, how long is that row going to be? On this page, we have 3 stitches here, plus these 10, plus another 5. And we have to look at the other page to see how it's going to end. Now, this is not universal, but many designers use the system as I do, where the shaded areas are the parts that are repeated on the page before. So if you look at these two side by side, you can see where the S in Christmas is the same as this S. So make sure that when you're reading your chart that you understand how the designer has it set up. So that long row of the roof then is going to be 10 plus 3 plus 5, so that's 18, 19, 20, 21 stitches. Now you might already be wondering about this other chimney, and right now I don't want you to worry about that. So we're going to be doing 10, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 stitches in this next row. As I said, I tend to sew when I'm doing my first half crosses going over, especially in a nice long row like this. At this point, I don't need these lines anymore, so I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of them. I'm going to stitch my first row here, and then I will be right back. I grew up in a very much a DIY household, and my father did a lot of woodworking, so I grew up hearing measure twice, cut once, over and over and over again. And it is certainly true that if you count twice, you'll stitch once. So I have now counted twice to make sure that I have 21 half crosses here. Don't just count once. You need to get the same number 2 times in a row to know that you have the right number of stitches. Now at this point, I'm going to take a moment and see if I can explain to you how I keep my threads parallel. And by the way, this kind of psychedelic set of lights you see across here, that's the sunlight coming through the blinds in my window to my right. I am comfortably sitting in a recliner and not at my desk where you usually see me stitching. So right now, let me see if I can show you the entirety of this thread. And this really isn't all that bad, but you can see where it's somewhat twisted here, there, and everywhere. So the concept of railroading is to make sure that your 2 threads are parallel, and that is important. I'm not disparaging that idea at all. But what I do find is that I don't want to have to railroad every stitch. So I'm going to put my needle between my 2 threads here and draw it along the length of my thread that's in my needle and make sure that it's parallel to start with. And you'll notice that as I'm kind of doing this in stages here so that the whole thing will stay on the screen, you'll see that as I'm pulling this closer and closer to the needle, do you see how it's getting more and more twisted up? So at this point, I've now pulled the needle back through itself, and I need to untangle this. And now my 2 threads are parallel from my stitching all the way to my needle. Now, I'm not going to say that this is a perfect method, but for the most part, I'm not going to have to manipulate this in any way to keep my threads parallel. But while I am stitching, I am constantly on the lookout to see that my two threads are parallel to each other as I'm stitching. So as I'm going back across, see how I'm holding this down with my thumb? And if it's the threads just before they're going into the fabric that matter. I'll be honest with you. My students have heard me say this in class. If I thought for a moment that I had to do that railroading thing with every stitch I took, I probably wouldn't do counter cross stitch, or I would only stitch things that I could stitch with a single strand and not with two strands. I just find it too tedious and time consuming. It is important for those two threads, when you are stitching with two threads, it's important that the two remain parallel to each other. And frankly, that's why a lot of people like stitching with flower thread, because the weight of a single strand of flower thread is equal to two strands of floss. And therefore, you don't have to concern yourself with the question of parallel. Now see how it's a little bit twisted there? So I'm just going to rotate my needle a little bit to untwist it. I realized I was rotating my needle off camera, but you saw the results, and that's what's important. Now, if you're wondering about that poor little lonely chimney, don't worry about it. We're going to get that chimney stitched. But right now I want to get establish this all important row for the roof. And I'm going to stitch all the way over, and then I'll pick up my dialogue in just a moment. I'm getting close to the end of this first row here. When I am wondering whether or not my threads are parallel, I just draw my needle between the two of them and keep right on going. And when I get to the end of this row, I'm going to simply start the next one. So I'm going to end that stitch and come down 2 threads. I've mentioned before the principle that when possible, start a stitch in an empty hole and end it in a shared hole. It was an educated guess, but I thought I would probably get to the end of the strand close to the right-hand side of my roof. And I am. I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of stitches in this row. And then when I start my next strand, I'll come up here and do the chimney and then rejoin where I am on the roof. So that was part of my strategy, and that simply comes from the experience of stitching for as long as I have. I am so glad to be started on this project, and I am thrilled with the people that have joined this endeavor, and I'm just so glad that you're here. Okay, so that gives me about 5 stitches on this row that are complete. Now on the back, I'm going to take my threaded needle and I'm going to pass under these 5 stitches. Actually, I think 4 stitches will be enough. When you are anchoring your thread under small, tight stitches like this, 4 or 5 stitches is plenty. Okay, now here is one of my absolute best practices, and that is do not leave a thread like this. If you don't think it's anchored enough, then go under one more stitch. Do not leave a tail with the idea that you're leaving it to make your thread more secure. And then cut off that excess, what I call dangerously close. And if you can see the tips of your scissors, you're not ever going to cut the wrong thing. So that's actually longer than I normally leave. Looking at our chart on page 4, again, we know that this chimney is symmetrical to the other one. So the whole chimney is going to be 1 stitch in from the edge of the roof, and it's going to be a total of 3 rows of 2 stitches each. So this is how I find that spot on my fabric. So my needle, this is going to be the edge of the chimney. So I'm going to come up 1, 2 stitches, 4 linen threads, or if you're on Aida, 2 squares, because I want to be at the bottom of that top row for the chimney. And from there, I'm going to come over 2, 4 linen threads or 2 squares on Aida and take that first half cross. Now once again, I'm using the loop method, so I'm not going to pull this entirely through until on the back I almost pulled it too far. Pull my needle through that loop and make sure it's tugged down flat against my fabric. So I'm going to do a short row of just 2 stitches, again using the Danish method. And I can already see how my thread is all twisted up. I need to fix that before I go any further. Okay, now I just was not paying attention and I let my working thread get in the way of my stitch. I think it's hard to see with this dark thread, but I could tell that I had caught it because I did not keep, I need to keep my needle under my working thread. might be wondering why I'm mainly stitching over here on the far right hand side of your viewing screen, but the apparatus I use to hold my iPhone is solid. It's not translucent, and so I can't see the middle. I can't see the middle of my own iPhone screen, and so if I go over here, I can't see what I'm stitching. So in case you've been wondering why I'm lurking over here on the far right hand side, there's a very practical reason for that. I need to find another mount that's translucent so I can see my whole video screen. Okay, so this finishes the chimney. The next stitch I'm going to take will begin right here. Now keep in mind that all of these stitches are ones that I completed with my last strand. So after doing the chimney, I can rejoin the roof. Now the question is whether or not I'm taking my thread too far to take it here. The best way to get an answer to that question is to turn it over. So I would be going from here to here. That's really not, excuse me, I'm sorry, I was off camera. So I would be going from here to here, which is not terribly far, but a safer thing to do is to just take a second and slip your needle under the stitch. Especially since this is a dark thread, you don't want to be carrying it too far. And now I'm just going to keep stitching across here. But before I leave you, I'm going to take a look at the chart again. And now I'm looking on page 5. Because on page 5, again, we've got this shaded area that shows you where this part joins the part that was on page 3. Okay, so here's page 3, where we had the top of the roof. And here you've got almost the whole, you've got all of the roof. You just are missing 2 of the stitches on the top of the chimney, but we've already done those, so that's fine. So this chart is what's going to help me see how many rows altogether am I doing in the roof. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 total rows across the roof. So I'm going to get all that work done before I join you again. So I'm completing row number 7 that finishes out the roof. So I'll anchor this thread on the back, trim it off, and we'll start the kind of light gold color for the house. Now I can see that I pulled that too tightly and I kind of dislodged that last stitch a little bit. So I'm going to go under a total of 5 of these stitches on the back. 4 is good, 5 is, as we say here in the South, is a gracious plenty. And I'm going to trim off that. Staying very close. So you can see where I have ended the various threads within the roof. Now let's take a look at the chart again. This is page 5. And right now, all I want you to concentrate on is the fact that we're going to have 2 complete rows of color number 7. Also notice that we're coming in 1 stitch from the edge of the roof. And just to be on the safe side, let's look at page 6 as well to make sure that there aren't any surprises here. Because as we're stitching, we're going to end our row 1 stitch short of the roof. One of the mysteries of counted cross stitch is many people think you have to count every stitch, and you really don't. Once you get a pattern established, then all the other rows are kind of correlate to that first one. So we're going to be 1 stitch in on the left and 1 stitch in on the right. Now color number 7, I happen to know is gold. But in case you didn't know, again, your color key is where you're going to find out. So whether you're using DMC or Cosmo, it's the antique gold color. And now I'm just going to happily stitch across and back, do 2 rows, and again I'll be stopping 1 stitch short of the edge of this roof. I'm finishing up the second of the 2 rows that go all the way across the house in the gold color. I'm going to start my needle down for the next row, but before I complete that stitch, let's look at the chart. One of the mistakes that a lot of people make when they're stitching is they carry a lot of thread on the back. So let me tell you what we're not going to do. We're not going to stitch the single 7 and then skip 2 and stitch a 7, skip 2 and stitch a 7. That is not an effective way of stitching. Instead, we're going to come down just these 3 stitches, and given the little bit of thread that I have left in my needle, I'm not sure how much more we'll do, but my plan is to stitch the windows and then go back and fill in the rest of this gold between them, because then I could stitch like this series of 3 and then carry my thread behind the already stitched window and do the next series of 3, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch these 3 because I have enough thread in my needle to do that. When I'm stitching a row like this going down, essentially you might think about it as being like a row of 1 stitch. And then a row of another single stitch. So I want to take this opportunity to show you a different way of ending your thread on the back when you don't have a long row like we've had so far. I do what I've nicknamed a serpentine crawl. I'm just going to slip my needle under this 1 stitch and then go back in the opposite direction and slip my needle under that stitch. So I'm going back and forth like a serpentine. And remember, I'm not piercing the fabric thread, the fabric at all. I'm just going under the existing stitches. And now that I'm worked my way up to this top row, I actually have a couple places that I can anchor it. So I'm going to go under like 3 stitches there. And once again, I'm going to cut this off very, very close. So now I'm ready to stitch my windows, and so I'm going to stitch all the windows across this top area. The windows are shown by the star symbol, and the star symbol is the light blue. Each window is just 2 stitches wide and 3 rows tall. So I'll stitch these 6 stitches and then I'll come over and do the next window. Once again, I started with a loop, and my first row of just 2 of these light blue stitches, and following with a second and then a third row to create one of the windows. Now, when we looked at the chart, we saw that there's going to be one row of gold in between the windows. So the question is, can I bring my thread from here over to here? Now I'm going to go ahead and take this stitch so we can look on the back and see what that looks like. That is not much of a traveling, and of course this part of the traveling thread is going to be covered by the row of gold that's going to come down in between here. So I'm just going to keep stitching my windows across the top of the house, and then when I get to the other side, I will rejoin you with some more comments. And starting with what is standard for me, my 30 inches of floss, that was just enough to do all the windows across the top of the house, which is a happy coincidence. So let's take a look at the best way to anchor this thread now. So this is what our back looks like. And here's my thread. Now, the tendency is to carry my thread this way, but I'm going to actually tuck it under these stitches. And the reason for that is to carry the stitch so that it's going in the same direction it would have gone in had I continued stitching. The stitches will look just a little bit different if you don't do that. If I had carried that thread this way, it would have looked different. And I'm sure there'll be other opportunities in this project that I can give you some evidence of what I'm talking about. Now, of course, slipping that working thread under 2 stitches on the back is far from sufficient for anchoring it. So now I am going to turn back the other way and go under. Can actually carry it across like this. Now I'm going to thread my needle with the antique gold color again and fill in between the windows. I secured my first stitch with a half cross, and now I'm going to continue down this column with single stitches. I'll do 3 of them all together. Take the time to find the actual hole without snagging one of the blue stitches that's next to where we're doing the gold. This is why a tapestry needle is not sharp, is because you're not ever piercing the actual fabric. You're going in a hole between fabric threads, and you're not piercing your floss either. You're gliding in between linen threads and the floss threads. Now, after doing these three, the question is where to go next. And what I would do is stitch the next row bottom up. So this is where I said earlier that we wouldn't always be stitching the Danish method. What I suggest to go up is I'm going to cross my stitches this way. So I'm going from top corner to bottom corner. This is why it really bothers me when people talk about that there being one way to make a cross stitch. It's not always bottom left corner to upper right corner. Obviously, I'm stitching upper right corner to bottom left corner, followed by upper left corner to bottom right corner. And that cross stitch is just as legitimate as any other cross stitch. So again, I'm going top right to bottom left, and then top left to bottom right. And now I'm going to cross over behind this next window and do the next row from top to bottom, making what is the more traditional way to make the cross stitch. And I'm just going to continue like this, working top to bottom and then bottom to top until I get over to the other side of the house. And just like that, I'm over here at the other end of the house, finishing the last of the 3 stitches. Now I still have quite a bit of thread left in my needle, but I don't want to work this next row right to left. I'm going to end my thread here and then start again over on this side. When possible, bury your thread where you don't already have some threads located. You kind of want to keep the back as flat as possible. So that's going to anchor that very well. And my scissors always seem to be right out of reach. So I'm going to clip this off. Now at this point, I still have quite a bit of thread left here. So what I'm going to do is, instead of using the loop method, I'm going to simply bury my thread over on this side of the house. Now be sure that when you start in this method that you're not going to pull this stitch too hard, this first one. Otherwise you just pull that tail right out. That's a method that you can use to start a thread when you're working with a single thread or when you're working with variegated. So now I have a full row all the way across, and I'll just keep working until I run out of floss. I'm glad I put this strand into play because I had enough to go all the way over and all the way back. So I'm going to bury this thread on the back and start a new strand. Take a peek at the chart and see, I think we have 2 rows of the antique gold beneath the windows. but I need to confirm that, because just like we count twice so we only have to stitch once, it's better to look at the chart twice and not have to rip something out. Is a second row of the gold beneath this row of windows. And I'm already kind of in my mind making a plan. I'm going to go over and back, and then just as I did before, stitch these 3 stitches. Then at that point, I'm still going to have a lot of thread left in my needle. So I'm going to park that thread and put in my windows and the middle door and the other set of windows. And then I'll come back and rethread that golden color and stitch in between, just like I did up here. So I'm back over to the left-hand side now. Just one more stitch to finish off here. And now I'm going to do my column of 3 stitches. People use the term parking a lot, and I might be using a little bit different. I'm just going to take some really big looping stitches with this thread off to the side, just to leave it in place. There's really no need to cut it off, because once I get my windows and my door done, then I can put that strand to use. So now I have 2 windows, a door, and 2 windows to do. I'm going to do the door next, and I'm going to do the door so that when I do my windows, I'll have a place to tunnel under to come across to do these windows. And what I'll do is I'll place them, of course I already have these 2 rows of gold done, and I will start it so that I'm in the middle of this window, and I'll be doing 3 stitches which will line me up with the middle of this window. Once again, I started with a loop on the back, and I'm going to do a row of just 3 stitches across. I took a peek at the chart, and I know that the door only has 6 rows in it, so as soon as I finish with these 3 stitches, the door will be done. And I can bury this thread on the back. And again, since it's only 3 stitches wide, I'm going to go under all of them across, and then turn around and go back this way also. Now I'll thread my needle with the blue and do a window here, a window here. I'll tunnel under behind the door and then do this set of windows. When asking yourself about carrying threads over, one of the questions, of course, is whether or not the threads on the back are going to show on the front. And of course, carrying my working thread across behind the door, that's not going to be a case because all this is going to get filled in. The other question is, will the distance be less if I just bury this thread and start another one? And the answer to that is no. I'm actually being more efficient by taking my thread across. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and tuck it under this stitch and this stitch, and then kind of work my way up towards the corner, so I'll be closer to where the top of the window is going to be. So if I had buried this thread to anchor it and started another thread, I'd be pretty much in the same place. So now over here, I'm leaving four threads or 2 squares unworked next to the door. And we'll do 2 more windows. And after I finish these 2 windows, I'll fill in the rest of the house with the yellow. Windows and door done. I'm going to unpark my golden color floss here and rethread my needle, and then I'm just going to start stitching just like I did before. I'll stitch this area and then stitch this part, and then I'm going to go back and forth here. I'm not going to carry the thread back and forth across the door. If I have enough left when I get here, then yes, I would bury it behind the door to come over here. But the thing you do not want to do is like do these 2 stitches, go behind the door to do these 2 stitches. Oh my, I am learning so much while I'm making these videos. I just did a whole segment with my video set in slow motion, which is why you're now watching this agonizingly slow process of stitching. And of course, the dialogue that I had to go with it is a little bit distorted, being in slow motion. So I'm making this voiceover to go with this section. What I'm doing here is I'm working the extreme right-hand section on the edge of the house, and then I'm going to work the next section working toward the left. It's just almost funny watching this. I hope that you are enjoying this. And then I'm going to do the final section between the window and the door. And I'm doing this so that I will end up with my threaded needle alongside the door, so I can do those last rows of the house working left to right in the Danish method. Just these last 2 stitches and the house is finished.